I made a video a couple weeks ago about 3 explanations for what is wrong with the world and how to address it. And all of them sort of centered around the elites. And in response to that, I had a couple people ask, hey, how do you define elites? And at least one person say, elites don't exist, like they're a myth or a snarl word or a scapegoat. And so I wanted to share how I understand elites, how I use the term. And to some degree, it is sort of like a you know it when you see it thing, which is Christopher Lasch in this book. Like, I don't think he gave a clear definition, but it's also clear what he means. But I also think there is... So, like, when I make a definition, it's an explanation of how I'm thinking about things, and I'm not going to put up with people being pedantically trying to hold me to the technicalities. Definitions for me are explaining how I'm thinking about things, but I'm not, like, looking at things doesn't meet this exact definition. So I wanted to share first how a few people have presented the idea of who the elites are and how that's defined, and then I'll tell you my understanding. So when I talk about elites, what I mean are the people who have meaningful power and influence over mass institutions. So mass institutions would be things like our schools, especially colleges, big media organizations, big nonprofits, big companies, and of course the government. And generally, I would define a mass institution, anything that has more than 150 people working for it, I would call a mass institution. And most organizations that have more than 50 people working for them, and that's based on Dunbar's numbers, which I have talked about before, Dunbar's circles. I feel like from what I've seen, because like 50-ish is day-to-day who you can interact with, 150 is basically a tribe. And it seems to me like above 50, it gets hard, if not impossible, to have a relatively like democratic, like understanding people on a one-to-one basis. And above 150, it definitely gets hard to do within these organizations. And so I don't know the exact number because I haven't actually worked at any organization between 50 and 150 people or been involved with one. So it's always been, I've been involved in organizations that either had more than 150 people or fewer than 50 people. But I think it's one of those two numbers. And so that's how I understand elites, are the people who have the power and influence to actually control and steer the direction of these organizations. And that's relevant because, like Nassim Nicholas Taleb talks about in Skin in the Game, like modern elites, as I'm using the term, don't really have skin in the game. Like, they don't face the consequences of the decisions they make in terms of either the people internal to these institutions or the things that they affect. And so that's how I understand it. That's how I use the term. But I've seen other definitions, and so I wanted to address those. And of course, probably one of the most common is the Marxist. I don't know if it comes from Marx, but it's the one you see from Marxists, which is it's the people who don't work to earn a living and only make money off of capital. And I think that's a really bad definition for several reasons. So first of all, they're thinking about like the top 1/10 of 1% of people, right? Like the super rich and old money type people. However, most people who are living off savings, investments, and don't work for a living are people who have retired after working, whether they have retired early or whether they retired at the normal retirement age. And some of them are people who made companies and retired from that. And of course, the Marxists would say, well, yeah, they're obviously capitalists, they're the 1%. But I feel like that's still different than the people who... Most of these people don't have active control. Like, even the very rich, like when you're rich and you're retired, you've given up the control of your company, you've sold your company. And the old money, they still have an ownership stake in their companies a lot of the time, but they rely on the managerial elites to run it, and they don't really control it. And so even though they have nominally more power and certainly a lot more money than we do, they don't have the power of the people who are sort of running these institutions day to day. And then Richard Reeves, just in Dream Hoarders, he uses a cutoff of the top, it's either the top 10% or top 20%, and I definitely, on that basis, like income-wise, my parents were top 10% of income when I was at least like college age, and I was probably at least top 20% when I was working in data science. But I feel like it's easy to quantify, but in terms of talking about the whole, again, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, these people not having skin in the game, the relevant factor for me is their control over these mass institutions, where the size and scale of these institutions allows them to not have skin in the game, to not face the consequences for their decisions. And then you have a few other definitions. So Neema Parvini seems to basically define it as anyone who is part of the managerial elite, and I kind of have a problem with that definition for a number of reasons. First of all, like he says, like even the woman who answers your phone at the local library is one of the elites, or managerial elites, and we should get rid of them. And I'm like, no, like local libraries like generally have fewer than 50 people involved, and they operate both with each other and with the community on a much more personal basis. And they don't have the same managerial problems. And they don't have a lot of power. Like your local librarian does not have a lot of power. And they have skin in the game of making sure the library works. And then the other thing is it excludes the counter-elites, which... So Samuel Francis, he got it from James Burnham's The Managerial Revolution, I think, but I still haven't read that one. But he talks about elites and counter-elites, where the counter-elites are the people who... They are basically the people who made their own businesses. And they often run small companies, so they don't have a lot of power. But then the ones who do have power and influence are the actual elites. So the people... And Nick Pardini has some great videos on this. And it's interesting, as I said, I met him in person, and also I'm looking at my channel, and he is one of my top overlapped channels as well, which isn't terribly surprising to me. So Nick Pardini has sort of had this same idea. So the counter-elites are still elites, like at the very top level. They don't share a lot of the values and like cultural norms and assumptions of the establishment elites, but they still have control over mass institutions and still tend to not have skin in the game, and it's the same problem. So like Jamie Dimon, head of JP Morgan Chase, might be an example of this, but certainly his attitude, he puts him in the counter-elites, but he's still not having skin in the game. He still acts like the institutional establishment elites. And then another definition that you have is from Musa al-Gharbi, where he says that the elites are basically the symbolic capitalists, the people who make a living off their ideas and sort of convincing people of stuff as opposed to really producing things. And as I said, my last job was, I thought it was an actual capitalist job, and it really was more of a symbolic capitalist job. And at least for the time being, like, I'm realizing I might actually make enough money off YouTube to at least defray my living expenses for a bit, but it's not my long-term goal. I still want to actually make capital. And so, because his argument is the symbolic capitalists are the ones who drive culture and taste and norms, and I think that is kind of true. And as I said, like, I'm sort of Schrodinger's symbolic capitalist. And one thing I've noticed that I want to acknowledge is people who are in the elites tend to either deny the elites exist at all, or they say the elites are the people beyond me, and they try to separate off the largest group they can that they can lead and govern without being governed and led themselves. And so you see this with the counter-elites, as Francis talked about. You see this with former colonial nations, where the colonial power gave power to a new clique of local elites. And it's something to be aware of, because it is something that I very credibly could be claimed to doing, at least until and again, my goal is I don't want to take over a mass institution. I want to actually build things. I want to start my own company, and I would like to build community organizations. And I would argue, like, as long as you're keeping them small, you still have skin in the game, but I think you could still make the case that elites who have skin in the game are still elites, and I would be an elite at that point, but again, when I use the term, when I'm talking about what the elites are doing, I'm talking about the ones who in some way control the direction of the managerial institutions, and who specifically don't have skin in the game. And so acknowledging that, yeah, I might have been and might be an elite by some definitions. Oh, and the other thing is, of course, you notice, as Richard Reeves mentions in Dream Hoarders, like, one of the ideas of the 1% is that it absolves culpability for these symbolic capitalists, like people who come from sometimes like economically making less than I do, but having more prestige, and often making a lot more. And it absolves, and you get to say, okay, well, we're the 99%, and you're trying to lead people who you aren't living in the same neighborhoods, you aren't connected with. And I mean, my goal is I want to have a life where I'm living in the neighborhood with like people of all walks of life and interacting and building an actual community. And one of the things that I think defines elites for me is like thinking about Christopher Lasch again, Revolt of the Elites, is the fact that they want to separate themselves. They do not want to do not interact with the hoi polloi. They only want to interact with people who think like them. And today they're happy to interact with people who don't look like them as long as they think like them. Whereas I'm like, first of all, as an autistic person, like most people don't think like me, and I'm used to that. But also, like, I wouldn't at this point want to be with only people who think like me, because I've realized there's benefits from understanding how other people think. So that's just a quick sort of explanation of my understanding of what the elites are and how I use the term, as well as acknowledging there are other ways people use the term, some of which I might be or might become, but I'm using it specifically for the people who control these mass institutions without having skin in the game. So anyways, thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, this is Leela, and I'll see y'all next time.